Gospel of Mark, chapter 7, title of the sermon today, Grit, Spit, and Persistent Faith. You'll understand as we read this morning. Starting in verse 24, says, Jesus got up and went away from there to the region of Tyre. And when he entered a house, he wanted no one to know of it, yet he could not escape notice. But after hearing of him, a woman whose little daughter had an unclean spirit immediately came and fell at his feet. Now the woman was a Gentile, of the Syrophoenician race, and she kept asking him to cast the demon out of her daughter. Verse 27, and he was saying to her, let the children be satisfied first, for it is not good to take the children's bread and throw it to the dogs. Ouch! Did Jesus call this woman a dog? We'll get to that in a second. Verse 28, but she answered and said to him, yes, Lord, but even the dogs under the table feed on the children's crumbs. And he said to her, because of this answer, go, the demon has gone out of your daughter. And going back to her home, she found that the child lying on the bed, the demon having left. That word lying in the Greek actually means thrown. It's not a gentle lying on the bed. She was thrown on the bed. So when this demon came out, she was thrown on the bed. Verse 31, and again he went out from the region of Tyre and came through Sidon to the Sea of Galilee within the region of Decapolis. They brought to him one who was deaf and spoke with difficulty, and they implored him to lay his hand on him. And Jesus took him aside from the crowd by himself and put his fingers into his ears, and after spitting, he touched his tongue with the saliva, and looking up to heaven with a deep sigh, he said, Ephphatha, that is, be opened. And his ears were opened, and the impediment of his tongue was removed, and he began speaking plainly. And he gave them orders not to tell anyone, he being Jesus, but the more he ordered them, the more widely they continued to proclaim it. And they were utterly astonished, saying, he has done all things well. He makes even the deaf to hear and the mute to speak. Interesting story, right? You have this woman that has this daughter that's possessed, comes to Jesus for help, and then you have these friends, really good friends, that bring this deaf and mute person to Jesus to be healed. These are these two examples that we see. So this is kind of the setting. Tyre and Sidon, they're off of the Mediterranean Sea right there on the left. You can kind of see them. There's a little red line going between them if you can't see it. But essentially they're on the Mediterranean Sea. They're far from Galilee. That area in the green is marked for those where Jews lived, right? So this is a Gentile area. And so Jesus goes there, and then later on he comes back down to Decapolis, which is in the bottom right-hand corner of this map. And that's where he ends the story. That's where he heals the deaf mute. And so at the beginning, we're up there in the Syrophoenician, the Syrian Phoenician area. And so Syria had conquered Phoenicia at this point. And so that's all there over on the left-hand side. And so essentially what's taking place, the scene is Jesus had just rebuked the Pharisees for neglecting and setting aside and invalidating the commands of God. Remember, we talked about tradition. And how the tradition of the elders of the Jews was actually extra biblical, and literally the traditions is all that they focused on, the Pharisees and the scribes, and they thought that was going to save them. And Jesus says, sorry, that's not the case. Your tradition it actually makes it to where you can't fulfill the commands of Christ. And so they invalidated the commands of God by upholding the tradition of the elders. And then Jesus started teaching about what actually defiles a man. Because in chapter 7, the very beginning of it, the whole reason that all this is coming about on this topic of tradition is because the Pharisees thought that the disciples, because they did not wash their hands before they ate, and remember, it wasn't that they didn't wash their hands hygienically, it was they didn't do the second washing, the ceremonial washing that the Pharisees believed that they should do. So it's not that they're eating with dirty hands. That's not the problem here. And so they are not ceremonial clean according to the Pharisees. And Jesus says, you know what? That's not what makes a person unclean. Anything you eat is not what defiles a man. Anything that goes into a man doesn't defile him. It's what comes out of a man that defiles him. That's what we talked about last week. The problem is it's a heart issue. That out of the abundance of the heart, the mouth speaks, Jesus says later on. And Jeremiah says that the heart of man is utterly wicked, right? Desperately sinful. Right? This is the heart problem that we have. We have dirty hearts. And Jesus is the only one that can clean our heart. And then right after this takes place, we get the story of the Syrophoenician woman. So in verse 24, it says, Jesus got up and went away from there to the region of Tyre. And when he had entered the house, he wanted no one to know of it. Did you notice that? Jesus didn't want anyone to know that he was in the house. So remember, this is not taking place within the Jewish community. He has traveled far to Tyre, almost like on a holiday, a vacation. You remember what's preceded the last few chapters in Mark as we've been studying is Jesus and the disciples have been looking for some peace and quiet to rest, and so that he can teach the disciples personally. And every time that happens, he's swarmed by crowds of people, right? And so instead of sticking around where everybody knows who he is, he goes to Tyre and Sidon, way away, far away, into a Gentile community. But he is still found. It says in verse 24, he could not escape notice. But after hearing of him, right? So someone is in this area sharing, being a witness to the great things that Jesus is doing. Right? His fame and his reputation is spreading and spreading. So after hearing of him, this woman whose little daughter had an unclean spirit immediately came and fell at his feet. And this woman was a Gentile of the Syrophoenician race. The reason why Mark includes that Syrophoenician race, Matthew states it as she's a Canaanite, right? He's trying to make the point that this is an unclean person. This is a person that is not a Jew. This is a person that, as a Jew, Jesus is not supposed to come into contact with the non-Jew person. It would defile him. Just like the Pharisees said that eating these certain foods and not doing a ceremonial cleansing would defile. Of course, Jesus has already thrown that out the window. He said that's not what defiles a man. And just as food is not what defiles a man, now Jesus basically by example says it's not the people you hang out with that defile you either. So this woman has everything against her. She's a Gentile. She's a woman, and in the ancient Near East, women were not held, they're not well thought of. Right? They don't get to vote. They don't have rights. Honestly, if there's any legal thing that ever takes place, more often than not, it's going to go with the husband or the man in the situation, never with the woman. I mean, it was really an environment and a culture that was oppressing women often. So, she's a Gentile, and if a Jew has contact with a Gentile, he's unclean. She's a woman, and if a rabbi met with a woman, he became unclean. And she's a pagan, right? She's not a Jew, and so there's another uncleanness. And then Jesus calls her a dog. And so we got to get to this. What in the world is going on? Notice something in verse 26 about this woman. Now the woman was a Gentile of the Syrophoenician race, and she kept asking him to cast the demon out of her. She kept asking. This persistence is an admirable quality within this woman. Very, very admirable. See, a lot of times we as Christians, we go ask God for something and we don't get the answer that we want, and so we stop asking. This woman kept asking, on and on and on again. In fact, in the Matthew account, we'll read a little bit later, he's defended by the disciples. The disciples are with Jesus in the time, and they're trying to mediate between the two. This woman's outside the door, wanting to get in, wanting Jesus to heal her daughter, and the disciples are, they're running interference. Jesus isn't going to the door. The disciples are there. Hey, this woman, no, I'm not here for her. I'm here for Israel. We'll see it later on. But this woman had persistence. You remember the parable that Jesus told in Luke chapter 11, verse 8? About the man who went to his friend at midnight and asked his friend for a loaf of bread because he had guests coming to stay with him. Right? We call it the midnight friend parable. Right? So in this parable, this man comes at the middle of the night and Jesus says, that man's not going to get up. He's going to say, look, my kids are in bed. Everyone's asleep. I'm not going to give you any bread. But then it says this in verse 8. It says, I tell you, even though he will not get up and give him anything because he is his friend, because of this man's persistence, he will get up and give him as much as he needs. Right? Jesus is saying, it doesn't matter that this guy is his friend, and as a friend, you're supposed to give someone a loaf of bread when they come at midnight, Right? That doesn't matter. It's the fact that he keeps knocking on the door and won't go away and disrupting everything going on. It's a very interesting parable because Jesus equates this to prayer. And that we are to be persistent in prayer, continually asking over and over and over again. Almost to the point of annoyance. And this is what this lady is doing. She kept asking him to cast the demon out of her daughter. So, Krista and I, we've been married for almost 10 years. And one day, this is before we were dating, I had my eye on her. I wanted to date her. And so I, in my smoothness, took her to a garden, but it's Botanical Gardens in Fort Worth, it's very, very beautiful, and so we're walking around and, we're just kind of casually walking and I just kind of swing my arm, fingers kind of meet and everything like that. And so she sticks her hands in her pockets, thumbs in the pockets, kind of like not holding your hand. We're not dating or anything like that. And so then I actually try to grab her hand and she just, kind of shakes me off, and keeps her hands in her pockets and everything. And I asked her the question, I said, how do you deal with rejection? She said, well, I accept it and I move on. And I said, I ignore it. And I keep trying. And so I tried to grab her hand again, and, this goes on back and forth, Eventually, I was able to hold her hand, and now, we're married and I get to hold her hand all the time. So my persistence was successful, right? And this woman kept asking over and over and over again. She wasn't willing to just say, no, that's it. I'm going to accept it and move on. Now, don't get me wrong. If you're rejected, for some reason that's valid, then you probably should not keep trying. Like you don't get a job. They say, sorry, you're not the candidate we're looking for. I don't know that it's the best idea to continue every single day going and standing in front of that manager saying, look, give me a job. Look, give me a job. It may work. And then your persistence, even as annoying as it is, will actually come to fruition. But that, that's not always the case. But in this instance, this woman is persistent, asking over and over and over again. She doesn't just ignore it and move on. She keeps asking until Jesus says this in verse 27. Let the children be satisfied first, for it is not good to take the children's bread and throw it to the dogs. Ouch! I mean, that's a pretty harsh statement. Most commentators believe this to be the most harsh parable ever recorded, that Jesus spoke. But I think we need to think about it a little bit. Let the children be satisfied first. That word first is important because it's not saying status of the child and the dog. It's saying order of the child and the dog. Right? That's an important point. Because Jesus is not trying to say that only children are worthy of food and dogs are not worthy of food. In this parable, children would be the nation of Israel and the dogs would be the Gentiles. In fact, many Jewish historians refer to the Gentile community as dogs. Scavengers, right? They just run and they take what they can and they're not clean. They're unclean animals. They scavenge, right? Like birds, like ravens. These unclean animals. Dogs were considered to be that. In fact, in the Old Testament, it talks about Queen Jezebel and this prophecy that she's going to be thrown down and the dogs are going to lick up her wounds and a dog returning to its vomit. Dogs are not thought of well in the Old Testament. But it's very, very interesting that this word for dog doesn't mean stray. There's actually a different Greek word used here. This word for dog that Jesus uses is a household pet. How many of you have pets at home? You treat your dogs well? Yeah? Too well, right? Sometimes they're like our kids. What do they call them? Fur babies? Yes. Right? Yeah, our fur babies. Jesus is not using the term for a stray dog, a mangy mutt that everyone shoos away whenever it comes onto their property. Jesus is using a term for an honored pet. Right? What happens whenever you're eating at the table and something falls on the floor? And your dog kind of starts going over there and you're like, no! You can't have that. That's not what I do with my dogs. I don't have to clean it up if they lick it up. So I'm like, yeah, go on, it's over here. Tap my foot on where the spot is, right? This is yours. But I'm not the type of person that's going to, cook a filet mignon and then cut it up and put it in my dog's food. He's not going to appreciate that. Therefore, I'm not going to give him something like that. The point that I'm trying to make here is that this is talking about the order, not the status. Right? He's not demeaning this woman in her status by calling her a dog. What he's saying is the children should be satisfied first. In fact, we see this in Romans chapter 1, verse 16, where Paul says, I am not ashamed of the gospel, for it is the power of God for the salvation to everyone who believes, to the Jew first, and then also to the Greek. Right? Paul understood that Jesus' mission was to the Jew first. Right, that he was going to gather the chicks under the hen's wings, right? These references, Jesus has said this over and over again. And so I don't think that he's actually ridiculing this woman. In fact, by her response, I'm almost positive that she doesn't take offense to it. Because look at what she says. She answered to him, yes, Lord, but even the dogs under the table feed on the children's crumbs. Right? She didn't say, you can't call me a dog. Get out of my country. I mean, Jesus is in a foreign place. This isn't his hometown. And yet, this woman is not offended. In fact, she uses the very parable that Jesus talks about as a way to garner what she desires. But she answered and said to him, yes, Lord, but even the dogs under the table's feet. I mean, persistence. This woman has basically been told no by Jesus, right? The children deserve the food first and then the crumbs for the dogs, right? And she doesn't stop. I mean, she just keeps asking, yeah, but, yes, Lord, I agree with you, but. Even the dogs on the table's feet. Notice that word children's. It's actually a different word than when Jesus used the word children. When Jesus used the word children, it was teknon in the Greek, which is a biological child. But when she uses the word, it's paidion, which is a general term for just someone who's under the care of the master of the house. Right? And so what she says is, yes, Lord, even the dogs under the table feed on those who are under the master. So, I mean, in her mindset, she's not focused on the fact that I'm a dog and they're a child. She's focused on the fact that we all get food. We're just debating on the timing of it. Because even the dog gets fed in your house, right? Your pet gets fed. A stray, kind of runs around looking for food. But someone who is your pet is going to get fed. It's just saying the priority is to feed the kids, and then it's to feed the dog. Now, a lot of households do it backwards. Some people feed the dog first, and then feed themselves. This is the way my boss did it, who's the president of the seminary. He had a dog, and he loves his dogs, and his dogs get yogurt, his dogs get prime rib, his dogs get everything. I'm surprised that they are still alive, honestly. I mean, if I actually believed in reincarnation, I would want to come back as his dog. Because he has the best life. He goes to the groomer once a week, gets bathed. I mean, they massage him at the groomer. This is a 4-hour expedition to the groomer. This is a nice place. As an intern, I took this dog there all the time, and he gets 3 square meals a day. He gets to lounge around and do whatever he wants. He gets to walk all over on campus where dogs are not allowed, but he's the president's dog, so he gets to go anywhere he wants, right? I mean, this is a well taken care of dog. This is a pet. This is someone that's loved in the household. It's not that they're going to go hungry. And Jesus is saying, you're not going to go hungry. It's just the children eat first. And so that's what Jesus is saying here in this illustration. And she says, look, even the dogs under the table feed on the children's crumbs. Right? Just the leftovers. You ever seen a kid eat in a high chair? It's everywhere, right? It's all over them. It's all over the high chair. It's all over the floor. And a pet in the house, what is that pet doing? They're right there underneath that high chair. They're having a feast. They're not complaining that they're not at the table. They're just happy that they get to eat the crumbs off of the child's plate, right? This is the idea here, right? She's like, yes, Lord, but even the dogs get to eat the crumbs. Man, this is a sharp woman. This woman knows what she's talking about. And Jesus, because of her response, says, because of this answer, go. The demon has gone out of your daughter. You know, we asked the question, why did Jesus' response change? First he said, no, it's not your time. And then he said, yeah, it's done. I want to point out three things here. I'll go on to the next one. You know, the woman's faith is undeniable in this instance. In Matthew chapter 15, it's the same story. It's a retelling of this story. It says, Jesus went away from there and withdrew into a district of Tyre and Sidon, and a Canaanite woman from that region came out and begged and began to cry out, saying, have mercy on me, Lord, Son of David. My daughter is cruelly demon-possessed. Cruelly demon-possessed. But he did not answer her a word. And his disciples came and implored him, saying, send her away because she keeps shouting at us. I told you it was a kind of a different account in Matthew. And he answered and said, this is Jesus, I was sent only to the lost sheep of the house of Israel. But she came and began to bow down before him, saying, Lord, help me. That persistence. And he answered and said, it is not good to take the children's bread and throw it to the dogs. But she said, yes, Lord, but even the dogs feed on the crumbs which fall from their master's table. And then Jesus said this to her, O woman, your faith is great. It shall be done for you as you wish. And her daughter was healed at once. O woman, your faith is great. This is not a Jewish woman. She doesn't know and believe in the prophecy of the Messiah, and yet she hears of this miraculous teacher named Jesus and goes and implores him and asks him and begs him to heal her daughter. It says she went back to her home in verse 30, back in Mark chapter 7, and she was thrown on the bed, the demon having left. Right? So this woman's faith is undeniable, and this woman's persistence is so admirable. She kept on trying. And the third thing, which I think why Jesus actually changed the course of his actions, why he decided to actually heal this woman's daughter, is that this woman's acceptance of God's plan and faith in the goodness of God, it's commendable. Right? I mean, she accepted the fact that Israel got to eat first. She accepted the fact that the children have first dibs on the food. And so she understands God's plan. She understands that the Gentiles eventually are going to be brought into the good news of the gospel. Remember Peter, a Jew, eventually is sent to Cornelius in the book of Acts. And in Cornelius, he sees this vision of all these food and all these different things. I mean, he sees all this going on around him, and he is amazed and says, yeah, the gospel is for all men. Doesn't matter their nation, doesn't matter their upbringing, doesn't matter whether they're Jews or not. Eventually, that's the plan. She knows this. She accepts it, and yet she still trusts in the goodness of God. She still trusts him to heal her daughter. It's an amazing story. What persistence. This woman didn't deserve Jesus' help, but through her faith, she receives his grace. It says the demon then had gone out of her daughter. You know, this is the one of only 3 instances in the New Testament where Jesus administered long distance healing, right? You know, he wasn't there. He wasn't next to the person, and he heals this woman. John chapter 4, verses 46 through 54 talks about the nobleman's son. He healed the nobleman's son at a distance. And then you've got Matthew chapter 8 and Luke chapter 7 that both talk about the centurion who came to Jesus and said, you know, my servant is ill. And Jesus said, let's go to him. And the centurion turns around and says, no, Lord, I too am a man of authority, and if I tell one of my guards, if I tell one of my soldiers to go and do it, they go and do it. And so I know just at your word it will be done. And Jesus says, go, your servant's healed. Right? It's cool. It's a cool story. But in all 3 of those instances, the phrase great faith is observed. Great faith. Not just I believe that you can do this, God, but this woman had great faith, and because of it, her daughter was healed. So that's the first story that we see here. The second story, Jesus decides to leave that area, and he goes to the region of Decapolis, and it says that they brought him one who was deaf and spoke, right? Who brought him? Well, it's the good friends of this person. I mean, you want to have friends like these guys. That, if you're deaf and you're mute and you can't communicate to the one person that can heal you, they're going to go do it for you. That's a good friend. That's someone you want to have around. It says they brought to him one who was deaf and spoke with difficulty in verse 32, and they implored him to lay his hands on him. That word employed is two words in the Greek. It's para and a kaleo. Kaleo means to call, and para, like parachute, right? You have a chute that comes alongside you. A paralegal is someone, a legal assistant that comes alongside you, right? It means to come alongside. And so, it's to call in reinforcements to your side. That's what they're doing. They're imploring him. It's a call for help. It's a cry for help. Jesus, come along with us and help us save our friend. Heal our friend. And then in one of the weirdest things ever, verse 33, Jesus took him aside from the crowd by himself and put his fingers into his ears, and after spitting, touched his tongue with, in some translations it'll say with the saliva. That's actually not in the Greek. It's just a continuation of the story, so they put it in there to make it more understandable in English. So he touched his tongue, and looking up to heaven with a deep sigh, he said, Aphatha, that is in Aramaic, Mark gives us the Greek translation, be opened. Right? So Jesus takes the guy off to the side, sticks his fingers in his ears, and spits, and then touches his tongue. And like in the Greek, it's not as obvious that he touched the spit and then touched his tongue. I mean, who knows exactly what's going on? But let's think about it for a second. This man can't hear. So Jesus takes him off alone. How is he going to communicate with him what he's about to do? Jesus is about to heal him, right? So, sign language? No, that's not talked about. He sticks his fingers in his ears, like indicating, hey, I'm about to open your ears, right? And then he touches his tongue. I'm about to heal your speech. Now, in John chapter 9, verse 6, we have an instance where it says this, when he had said this, he spat on the ground and made clay of the spittle and applied the clay to his eyes. Right, so Jesus did this to a blind person, right? He spit on the ground, made some clay. Maybe that's what's going on here. Mark's description isn't that vivid. We don't know exactly what's going on. So he does something with his spit, and he touches his tongue. And of course we think this is really gross, right, here in America. We're like, man, anything to do with spit is just disgusting, right? But do you know in some cultures, if you spit on someone, it's actually a sign of a blessing? African cultures, that's true. Like, we so often take our Western mentality and put it into the text, and then try to interpret the text based on that. And we're like, well, obviously this can't actually happen in the Bible. This was a mistake. It was a scribal error because no one spits on someone else and thinks that it's okay. Right? But in other cultures, we have to put ourselves into the understanding of the culture. At this time, do you know that they were actually, this process of spitting, making mud, and applying it as a salve is very, very normal for medicinal purposes in the ancient Near East when this is taking place? It's very, very common. And so it's not weird. We think it's weird when we read it, but it's really not weird when you consider the historical context. And when we interpret the Bible, we have to do so in light of its history. We have to look at the historical context that the Bible was written in order to understand it. So I have this pastor friend. He passed away actually a few years ago. His name was Shigoi. So when I was in Zimbabwe, we planted churches together. And in Africa, in Zimbabwe, in rural Africa, they're very, very touchy. So I first get there, and I'm from Western culture, I might slug my friend, but I'm not going to hold his hand. Well, Shigoi just comes up and holds my hand. And we're just sitting there talking, and he's just swinging and holding my hand. This is totally normal. There's nothing homosexual about this relationship. This is just normal in Africa. The guys do that, the girls do that. It's odd. The men and women don't do that in public. They never hold each other's hands in public. Even married men and women don't hold their hands in public. But they'll grab their friends, who's of the same gender, and they'll just walk around and hold. He would come up to me from behind, and he would put his arms around me, like my stomach, right? So I just, all these arms, and everything. And I'm like, well, I don't mind if my wife does that, but I don't really necessarily want some, 6'2" soccer player African coming up and doing that. It was weird. It was unnatural. It was uncommon. It's a different culture. And that's exactly what's going on here. It's just a different culture. But whenever we understand that, we understand that Jesus is doing something that's culturally acceptable. He looks up to heaven and he says, "Be opened." And his ears were opened and the impediment of his tongue was removed. In the Greek, that's a really cool line. It's not just that the impediment of his tongue was removed. Literally, it reads like this. It's the word for chain, that word impediment. Right? The chain of his tongue was removed. Right? His tongue was in bondage. His tongue was captured and he was not the master of it. Right? I mean, it's a cool picture that his chain was removed, the impediment of his tongue. And he began speaking clearly, plainly. Everyone could understand him. It says he gave them orders not to tell anyone, but the more he ordered them, the more widely they continued to proclaim it. If you remember back in chapter 1, of Mark, there was a similar scenario. 1 verses 44 through 45. Jesus says to this person that he healed, he was a leper. He says, "See that you say nothing to anyone, but go show yourself to the priests and offer for your cleansing what Moses commanded as a testimony to them." But he went out and began to proclaim it freely and to spread the news around to such an extent that Jesus could no longer publicly enter a city and stayed out in the unpopulated areas because they were coming to him from everywhere. And I told you guys whenever I preached that sermon back in Mark chapter 1, verses 44 through 45, that even though this man who was a leper was healed, because he did not follow the commands of Christ, there was a consequence. Jesus was no longer able to go teach in the synagogues, which is what he had been doing the entire time since Mark began, teaching in the synagogues, teaching to the Jews. And now he's on the outskirts of town because there's so many people, right? This man, even though he was healed, he didn't follow the commands of Christ, and there was a consequence to that. You have a similar situation here. Jesus is in Decapolis, and he's telling these non-Jews, look, he's giving the orders in verse 36. Don't tell anyone. But the more that he ordered them, the more they widely continued to proclaim it. Another scenario is Mark chapter 5, verses 19 through 20. It says, Jesus told this man, "Go to your home, to your people, report what great things the Lord has done for you, and how he had mercy on you." This is the opposite. This is actually the healing of the Gennesaret, the demoniac, right? The man who was possessed in Gennesaret. He's healed, and Jesus says, "Go to your home and tell everyone." Well, guess where his home was? Decapolis. Where Jesus is now, where all these people are surrounding him, right? This guy went and shared about all the great things that Jesus was doing and followed the commands of Christ. He listened to what Jesus said, and you see the results. In this instance, Jesus is saying, don't tell anyone, yet they do it anyway. Verse 37 is interesting. It says, they were utterly astonished, saying, "He has done all things well. He makes even the deaf to hear and the mute to speak." So chapter 7 has dealt with the issue of tradition and its inability to save. And the reason that it's not able to save is because it's really a heart issue. And the solution is grace alone through faith alone. They say this, "He has done all things well." That phrase is very similar to Genesis 1:31, where it says God saw all that he had made and it was very good. When you take that over into the Greek, it's basically the same wording. He even makes the deaf and the mute to speak. This phrase is also, you'll see it in Isaiah chapter 35, verses 5 through 6. Isaiah 35, 5 through 6 says, "Then the eyes of the blind will be opened, and the ears of the deaf will be unstopped, and then the lame will leap like deer, and the tongue of the mute will shout for joy. For waters will break forth in the wilderness and streams in the Arabah." Right, this is fulfillment of prophecy. It's amazing to see how this chapter unfolds. But there's an important point that I want us to think about. The Pharisees thought their tradition could save them. And they thought that what they did on the outside was actually what defiled them. And so they kept ritual cleansings. They kept themselves pure. They didn't come into contact with things that were impure. Because they didn't realize that the impurities come from within, according to Christ. He said it's from the heart. That's the issue. And then we have this example of a woman of great faith and a deaf mute of great faith and his friends of great faith. And we see that faith is what's necessary in order to receive salvation. So Ephesians chapter 2, verses 8 and 9 says, "For it is by grace you have been saved through faith." And this salvation, this work of being saved, it's not of yourselves, but it's the gift of God through Christ Jesus. And so, essentially, this is what's taking place. This Syrophoenician woman, this Gentile, this defiled woman, receives grace from God. This deaf mute, who's a Gentile, who's unworthy of Christ's love and sacrifice, he receives grace from God. And it's through their faith that grace is realized. Just as in salvation, just as we, those of us who have accepted Christ, have placed their faith and trust in Christ to receive His grace, which is good news. That concludes chapter 7. Next time we'll be on chapter 8. Let's pray together. God, we're grateful for your word. We're grateful for the instruction that we find in it. And Father, I pray that as we close the service today, God, that you would just impress upon our hearts the reality of the heart problem that we have, our need for grace from a good and gracious God, and that we get that grace. We receive that